All right. Well, thanks for joining us for the third part in our Jeremiah series. Quick recap is first week was Jeremiah gets called by the Lord. Lord says, I need you to deliver a message. Jeremiah says, no. Lord says, go anyway. And he does. And he's off to declare what the Lord says. And then last week we covered chapters 2 through 36 in the book of Jeremiah. And it's basically this conversation back and forth where the Lord says, hey, go tell them these things. Why are they not listening to me? How come my people don't listen to me? Bad things are going to happen to them. Jeremiah says, but come on, we're not any worse than anybody else. Everybody else around here is terrible too. And the Lord says, yeah, but you're supposed to be special. You were supposed to be exceptional. You're supposed to be my chosen people and not just like everybody else. And that's where we left it. So Jeremiah went off and to preach the word and do what the Lord says. And we get to these chapters now. It's chapters 36, 7, 8, and 9. So 4 chapters is all we're talking about today. But wow, there is a lot that's happening. And there's a lot to keep track of as far as the alliances and preferences of people. So I don't know if I've bitten off more than I can chew, but we're going to try to navigate you through this because the story has a lot of changing of alliances. And the way that we'll back up a little bit and start with King Josiah. This is the one king that people know about because he's the one who had the scrolls they found in the temple, and he says, oh no, we should be obeying these things. We haven't been doing this for centuries. We got to get going right. So he makes all the changes in the kingdom and says, we're going to start worshiping the Lord again. And that seems great. Except for what happens is the Babylonians are over on the side. The Egyptians are below. Babylonians are coming through. They're taking over Assyria. So the Egyptians move on Jerusalem in an attempt to head off the Babylonians. Well, King Josiah sees the Egyptians as a threat. He's not supposed to go fight them, but he does. And in going to fight the Egyptians, he gets killed. And as a result of his death, the Egyptians install King Jehoiakim, and he's basically a puppet of the Egyptians. So he's kind of like one of the earlier King Herod types, where King Herod was a vassal of the Romans. King Jehoiakim was a puppet of the Egyptians. And this starts off this chain of events where there's competing for power between Babylon and Egypt, and the kings of Israel aren't sure how to navigate this global politics, as it were, or regional politics, I guess. And what we pick up from our representations of these things is kind of this struggle between selfishness and science. I don't like really calling it science, but it's the best word I could come up with. But Egypt represents this desire to only accept things through facts and the senses and science. And it's particularly about spiritual things. So you can imagine the person who says, well, I'm not going to believe in this because I can't see it. Or I'm not going to believe in this because I can't touch it or smell it or whatever. That's the kind of the bad connotation to Egypt. Babylon is about selfishness and about using other people to accomplish your means. And we have King Jehoiakim in the middle, who is a king who worships false gods. And so because he's following false gods, he's susceptible to being manipulated by a desire to, selfishness, desire to make number one in charge, and also a desire to make spirituality a science, which it isn't. And so the next 4 chapters deal with how this all plays out. And it starts off, as I say, King Jehoiakim is a puppet of the Egyptians. Babylonians make further movement, and they defeat the Egyptians in a battle. And so Jehoiakim changes sides. He says, all right, I give up. You guys are my guys now. I'm now going to pay the Babylonians money, and I'm going to be an ally to the Babylonians. So he changes sides. And then, a few years later, the Egyptians win a battle against the Babylonians. So he switches sides again. And this goes back a couple times to where finally at the end of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and lays siege to Jerusalem. And it's during this siege that a lot of these stories happen now. So the siege is happening. King Jehoiakim isn't sure what to do. Jeremiah is told by the Lord, go tell these guys what's going to happen. Go tell them about the destruction that's going to happen. This siege is just the beginning of it. Look out. So the king so Jeremiah sends his servant to the king's court because Jeremiah is not allowed on the premises. They don't like him. So the servant goes out there, starts preaching the message to all of the king's servants and his governors and whatnot. The governors say, uh-oh, what do? We got to tell the king. Does the king know this? No. So they take the scroll. These administrators start telling the king what's going on. And they say to Jeremiah and his servant, go and hide. So part of the thing that you have to observe here is the relationship of Jeremiah to these kings. When the story starts, Jeremiah is not allowed on the premises. Now they've got the word from the Lord and he's told, go and hide. So it gives you an idea about the king's interest in following what the Lord has to say, which is basically none. When you're told to go and hide from the king, clearly he has no interest. So the servant reads the administrators read the king the words of the Lord. And you can imagine, it's a scroll, and it's, you roll through a scroll. And the way it describes it is as the servant is reading through it, the king cuts off the parts that have been read, and he throws them into the fire. And it's this picture about how, fire represents lusts and desires. So it's this picture about how when we hear the Lord's word, if we are subject to Babylon or to ourselves or subject to something else other than the Lord, what do? We just chuck it into our desires and it all goes away. How many times have you been told, oh, well, you shouldn't do this. Oh, but I want to do this. And your want to do it overwhelms the being told not to. It's part of life. We all do that at some point. So this is what the king is doing. He's checking it out and getting rid of it. And of course, what ends up happening? The Babylonians come in and they take over. So they install a new king. Jehoiakim is out and they have King Zedekiah. But the difference here is that with King Zedekiah, Jeremiah is allowed to run around and do whatever he wants. They don't have any leash on him. And the picture here is just that. Think about selfishness. And selfishness is going to allow the Lord's word to be heard, but only if they can manipulate it. So King Zedekiah is willing to hear what the prophet has to say, but it's not that he wants to do it. He just wants to use those words to twist them and manipulate them and do what he wants to do. It's the mark of a selfish person. They're willing to hear anything from anybody, but they're going to twist it and use it to their own ends. So that's what's going on in this story. Well, what ends up happening is Jeremiah ends up with a free movement. He's been preaching against how the Babylonians are going to take over. Jeremiah leaves Jerusalem and he's on his way to go deal with some property business off in another tribe. Which is odd to hear, but that's what it says. He's got some property to deal with. Some of the Jewish soldiers see Jeremiah leaving. And they say, you're a traitor. You're going over to the Babylonians. And Jeremiah says, no, I'm not going to the Babylonians. Yes, you are. And they capture him and they put him in prison. King Zedekiah, though, because he is interested in what Jeremiah has to say, eventually calls Jeremiah and says, hey, I want to hear what you tell me what the Lord has to say. And this is where I'm going to pick up. It's Jeremiah chapter 37 in your order of service, if you want to follow along. It says, Jeremiah was put into a vaulted cell in a dungeon, where he remained a long time. Then King Zedekiah sent for him and brought him to the palace, where he asked him privately, Is there any word from the Lord? Yes, Jeremiah replied, You will be delivered into the hands of the king of Babylon. But now, my lord the king, please listen. Let me bring my petition before you. Do not send me back to the house of Jonathan the secretary, or I will die there. King Zedekiah then gave orders for Jeremiah to be placed in the courtyard of the guard and given a loaf of bread from the street of the bakers each day until all the bread in the city was gone. So Jeremiah remained in the courtyard of the guard. Courtyards represent the natural level of our mind. So Jeremiah has gone from, at the beginning of this series, to being unable to enter in Jerusalem anywhere, to going into hiding. Babylonians take over, now he can move around, and now he's got himself closer to the king. It's not necessarily for good motivations at this point, but he's got himself closer. And this is all this picture of the kind of person who is motivated by incentives. You know, when the writings talk about, this is the story about the reformation of the natural person. It's somebody who is motivated by incentives. Somebody who says, all right, I'm going to do this because it's going to work well for me. Or I'm not going to do that because it's going to be bad for me. So you see these kings trying to navigate the situation of the day. They've got these competing forces, the Babylonians and the Egyptians. How do we survive in this? Isn't that the fundamental question that they're all trying to answer? How do I survive this? And on one hand, they've got the Babylonians saying, look, we're going to get you. The Egyptians are saying, we could be allies, but, we're not super powerful. And then you've got the other advice of Jeremiah saying, look, do what the Lord says, ally with the Babylonians, surrender to them, and this will all be okay. You're going to be subject to them, but it'll be all right. And so siding with the Egyptians is about, trusting in your own self. And so is siding with the Babylonians, or fighting with the Babylonians, is trusting in yourself. And it's hard. I think about this kind of stuff regularly, about how do you deal with navigating life and doing the right thing when you think doing the right thing is going to land you in a pile of trouble. Take a very simple example. You're in a parking lot in a shopping center and you bang into somebody's car. Can you get away with it and run away and not leave your number? Sure, you probably can. Well, can you side with Egyptians or Babylonians and find some way to justify getting out of it? Can you manipulate this situation to your own end? Instead of taking blame for it, you blame it on somebody else. Put a note on the car saying, hey, I saw somebody else with this rego plate, bang into you. Or somehow you twist the situation where you have a bump and you go away from the two parties peacefully, and then you turn around and sue them, even though it was your fault. You create a false lawsuit. There are all sorts of ways you can play out these scenarios to try to make the situation come out okay, at least what you think is okay for yourself, when the Lord's just saying, look, just do what's right. Just do what's right, and it'll be okay. The story goes on here that the Babylonians, they do take over. And Zedekiah wants to hear from Jeremiah some more. Tell me what's going to happen. Tell me what's going to happen. And he keeps saying, it's going to go bad for you. Give up. Give in to the Babylonians. Keep saying it over and over. And the point happens where Jeremiah, because he's now free to move around, he goes into the city center. And he starts telling people it's going to go bad for you. This is chapter 38, verses 2 to 6 here. It's talking about this. He says, this is what the Lord says, and he's talking to the people of the city, not the king. Whoever stays in this city will die by sword, famine, or plague. But whoever goes over to the Babylonians will live. They will escape with their lives. They will live there. And this is what the Lord says. This city will certainly be given into the hands of the army of the king of Babylon, who will capture it. Then the officials said to the king, this man should be put to death. He is discouraging the soldiers who are left in the city, as well as the people, by the things he is saying to them. This man is not seeking the good of these people, but their ruin. He is in your hands, King Zedekiah answered. The king can do nothing to oppose you. So they took Jeremiah and put him in the cistern of Malachia, the king's son, who was in the courtyard of the guard. They lowered Jeremiah by ropes into the cistern. It had no water in it, only mud, and Jeremiah sank down into the mud. Not too long later, another fellow, his name is Ebed-Melech, comes along and sees Jeremiah in the pit, and he says, this shouldn't be happening. He goes to the king. He says, King, this is Jeremiah the prophet. We should not have him in the pit. So the king says, all right, grab 30 men and pull him out. And on the back cover is the last reading, and it talks about what this pit represents. The pit into which they let down Jeremiah the prophet, and out of which Ebed-Melech and the men with him drew Jeremiah by means of old, cast-off, and worn-out things, signifies the truth of doctrine falsified. The prophet signifying truth of doctrine, and to be let down into the pit signifies to be falsified, and the old cast-off and worn-out things by which he was drawn out signify the vindication and restitution of the truth by doctrine by means of such good and truths of the sense of the letter of the word as had not been perceived and understood, and therefore had been neglected and rejected, and this is the signification of old things. So when they pull Jeremiah out, they use some old rags and clothes, they tie him together, they wrap them around him, and they pull him up by these old garments. And the idea is showing here that, okay, the old things, the clothes, the garments, and Jeremiah have value, and they're vindicated and pulled out. And sure enough, what ends up happening by the end of the chapter is the king Zedekiah decides he's going to lead a revolt against Babylon. He says, we've got him in a weak spot. We're going to revolt and fight back. We're not just going to give in to them like Jeremiah says. Babylon doesn't like that, so they send out their big army and they destroy the city. They burn it down. They chase out the king. They get his wives and his children. They carry them all off. It's the end. It's the end. King Zedekiah is the last king of the Davidic line. So Saul, David, Solomon, and from there on, it goes down to King Zedekiah, and he's the last of them. And so this story is this, as you can see, this picture between how Egypt and Babylon are manipulated by the kings, how the kings try to manipulate them, how we are in play here to try to follow the Lord's word at a time when we feel like the Lord's word is too hard to follow. Going over to Babylon and giving up to them just seems incomprehensible. How can we do it? This isn't going to go well for me. The Lord's telling you, do it. It's like one of those moments where the Lord says, tell the truth. Do the right thing. Even though this is going to be painful for you, do it anyway. Because going over to the other sides is going to be even worse for you. How many times I use the example of a parking lot bang on purpose because I actually had one happen a few years ago where I dinged into somebody's car and I was just so distraught by it. I was just so mad at myself. It wasn't a whole lot, but I dinged this guy's BMW and I thought, this is going to be expensive. I don't want to deal with this. What do I do? And I'm like, I ended up leaving my name and number on the guy's car. And eventually it took a couple weeks, but they eventually call up. We exchanged some information. but then nothing ever came of it. They just said, you know what? It's not enough. Don't worry about it, and left it go. And so for all the machinations in my mind of how to deal with this situation, oh, this is going to be so bad for me. Doing the right thing, which felt expensive at the time, ended up being just fine. It's the same thing with other things in life where we think, oh, this is going to be bad if I do the right thing, but it ends up being okay. And that's the story here. And it all goes wrong for these guys because these kings worship false gods. That's the key of this entire Old Testament, is the king has the false god as his god, not the real Lord. He's not following that, and that's why they make the bad choices. This is Jeremiah part 3, and it's a struggle.